wanted Candy those flat, those hydrangeas. He grows them in the yard that color. I bet $1 to me. When I first came back to Christina was there, and I hired you for my cases. And I'll never forget this. I came to his office. It's been 22 years. Came to his office. It was snowing, so I had to bring her with me. She was dead. And I was sitting out on the porch. She's like, I just don't think I just thought my life hate you, man, you. And honey, that was Christina. I had on my lap. She went like that. And he melted. He took her across that table in his office.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Bristol Virginia Bar Association and the City of Bristol, Virginia, I want to welcome everyone here today for a joyous occasion. We have a room full of judges. We have city council members, I think former city council members. We have the mayor. We have, I think, some former mayors. We have a lot of distinguished people in all shapes and sizes. So I won't try to name everyone. Instead, I will just simply say thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules, and thank you for being here today on what's truly an historic occasion. From 1910 until 2003, a George M. Warren strolled the halls of either this building or the predecessor courthouse, I believe on Water Street here in Bristol. Think about that. Almost 100 years of George M. Warren practiced the trade and was one of the most distinguished lawyers here in town. That's an incredible, incredible thing to think about. Both of them, George M. Warren Sr. here and George M. Warren Jr. were pillars in the community, pillars in the legal field, and pillars throughout the Commonwealth. As a result, last year, the city council decided to recognize both of them and their great achievements and their contributions to the city. As a result, the city council, Councilman Odom, probably forget somebody, Councilman Seal, Councilman Odom, Mayor Hubbard, Catherine Brillhart, and Bill Hartley voted unanimously to rename the courthouse the George M. Warren Justice Center. And what a fitting name, what a fitting tribute. I think it's important, though, I think most of the people in the room knew and loved George M. Warren Jr. Most of us did not know George M. Warren Sr. But I think it's very, very important to recognize as you pass by this building in the days and years ahead, or you do your business here, or you practice law here, I think it's important to recognize when you see those names, but see that name on the courthouse, that you recognize that it is in honor of both George M. Warrens, both George M. Warren Jr. and George M. Warren Sr. Both men served in the House of Delegates in the Commonwealth. Both men were in the Virginia State Senate. Mr. Warren Sr. was a mayor of the city for two terms. He was the mayor for 10 years total. And Mr. Warren Jr. was Commonwealth's attorney for an incredible 26 years, from 1976 to 2002. Both of them served on the bench in some capacity. George M. Warren Sr. was the judge of what was known as the police court back in the 1920s, I believe. And George M. Warren Jr. not only ended his career as Judge Pro Tem on the General District Court, but much earlier served on what is now known as the U.S. Magistrate. At the time, it was known as, I believe, the U.S. Commissioner. So the bottom line is both of them had accomplishments that were just really incredible that spanned a 100-year time period. I returned to Bristol to practice law in 1982, and like most young lawyers, I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and scared to death. And as a criminal, as somebody who's starting to practice law, generally the first thing that you end up doing is getting on the court-appointed list and doing criminal law. Well, what that meant, if you were my age and my era in the city of Bristol, it meant that you were trying cases against George Warren. And for those of you who practice law, you know what that means, or know what that meant. For those that perhaps never did see Mr. Warren in action, he had a booming voice. He had a voice that would make James Earl Jones jealous. And that kind of voice was like God was speaking when he addressed a jury. And he had a keen wit. He had a sharp mind. And the bottom line is he was something else in the courtroom. He could, just by the change of the voice, the inflection of his voice, or an IC, or a he could, through cross-examination, get more out of a witness or destroy a witness than most lawyers could get with 100 questions. He was, I often laughed, he could take what I call self-righteousness. He could take it to an art form. He would pound, I guess it would be on that table right there, he would pound on it, and he would make a passion speech to the jury, and I'd be sitting over at this table, and many other attorneys in the room can relate to this. You're taught to look at the jury, try to read the jury. Well, you'd read the jury, and you would see that you were in a lot of trouble. And you would just want to kind of slide under the table or maybe sneak out of the courtroom. But the great thing about practicing early against George Warren is you learned you had to get better. You learned to prepare your case. You learned to hone your skills, and to this day, I thank George probably more than anybody as somebody who taught me to practice law and hopefully do it the right way. The thing that was so impressive about Mr. Warren was, despite his immense talents, he was humble. And no matter how green of an attorney you were, he treated you with respect, he treated you with dignity, and he taught other attorneys through his actions to treat others that way. And to this day, I would like to think that the practice here in Bristol is a little different than in other places. We are a civil bar, and I think a lot of that has to do with George M. Warren Jr., who would tell you if he were here that he learned to practice that way from his father, George M. Warren Sr. I often joke that if you were to look up the term Southern gentleman in a dictionary, you'd have a picture of George. I mean, he was the consummate Southern gentleman. He was a very proud Virginia gentleman. I could go on forever singing Mr. Warren's praises, and like to tell a lot of funny stories that occurred over the years, but I have to give way to others. But I did want to tell one story that has stuck with me. It's not even the legal story necessarily, but when I was a young man, I practiced in law for just a couple of years, and we were starting a family and bought a house. And I'm with George for some reason, probably plea bargaining or doing something. I'm telling Miss Warren that I'm buying this house and I have a lot of work. Got to go home, got a lot of work to do. To which he says, "Well, son, let me tell you a story." And he proceeds to say that when I was a young man, he goes, on a Saturday morning, I was at my house and I was up on the ladder and I was painting. And his mom comes along, and his mom, as he told the story, if he told it accurately, I don't know, but he tells the story. He says, his mom comes by and looks up at him and he says, "George, what are you doing up there on that ladder?" To which he replied, "Painting, Mama." And she said, "Paint? Well, if you can make as good of a living painting as you can practicing law, I think you ought to quit the practice and do that full time." To which he says he came down off the ladder, got cleaned up, got in his car, drove down to the office, and never hit a lick again. So whenever I'm thinking about maybe picking up a paintbrush or a hammer or a saw or whatever, I think of George's words, and I usually put it down. I don't always go back to the office. I usually get on the couch, but it saved me a lot of work in the years. And with that, I want to recognize Judge Flanagan, who's going to speak to you a little bit about primarily George M. Warren Sr.
Mayor Hubbard, members of the council, members of the judiciary, members of the bar, Mrs. Warren, members of the Warren family, friends of the Warren family, members of the public. The city of Bristol has been in existence for 126 years. For 100 of those years, the city was blessed with the leadership, presence, and loyalty of two powerful forces, father and son, George Marvin Warren and George Marvin Warren Jr. Both were graduates of Emory and Henry College. Both were graduates of the University of Virginia School of Law. In recognition of the extraordinary service of these gentlemen to this community, it's only fitting that an important city building, one that houses its halls of justice, should be designated as an ongoing reminder to all who enter its doors of the contributions to this community of these gentlemen. It's my privilege to specifically refer you to George Marvin Warren, father of George Marvin Warren Jr. Others will address George Jr., and I'm going to address George. We refer to him as Senior getting together, but somewhere along the line I got the word maybe he didn't take a liking to that particular part of it, the senior part, so I will avoid that reference. George Warren was born to Thomas J. Warren and Mary E. Davis Warren in Washington County, Virginia on May 6, 1879. Yes, 1 month from today marks the 137th anniversary of his birth. His father, Thomas Warren, was a farmer and merchant in Washington County in the Emory, Meadowview area for many years. George graduated from Emory and Henry in 1904 and thereafter taught school in Washington County, Virginia for 3 years or so, traveling from spot to spot by horseback. Following his stint as a teacher, he entered the University of Virginia School of Law, graduating from that school in 1909. It was when he was a student at Emory and Henry that his exceptional skills of oration were recognized and developed as a member of one of the debate societies there at Emory and Henry. He graduated, as I indicated, from law school in 1909. In 1910, he moved to the young city of Bristol and began the practice of law. First alone, and then for a time in association with James L. Davis, who's father of Judge Robert Davis, whose portrait is on the wall behind you. His impact on the community was immediate. And only 2 years later, he was selected as mayor of this city in a political upset that was so shocking that it was reported in the Richmond Times, as though they really cared what was going on there. But think about that. At the time, the political race for mayor was a hotly contested race, so I have read. And here we have someone coming in who's been here 2 years, and he wins the office of mayor. He remained in that position until 1920, from 1912 to 1920. And he was re-elected as mayor once again in 1923. From 1912 until 1922, he served as judge of the police court for the city of Bristol, Virginia. In 1914, he married Ruba Litton of Lee County, Virginia, and they had 3 children. Jean, Julia, and George Jr., the baby of the family. As mayor, he was recognized as being progressive and a forward-thinking leader. It was during his tenure as mayor that State Street was electrified, if you will. The lights on State Street became electric. That was done with great hullabaloo. It was referred to as the Great White Way. And on June 21, I believe it was, of 1913, there was great celebration with bands and parade and speakers. And at 9:30 p.m., the switch was flipped to light the Great White Way. It was also during his tenure, and you've probably seen this photograph in a number of books on the history of Bristol, the first transatlantic telephone call made from the city of Bristol, appropriately to Bristol, England. It was during his tenure as mayor that the preposterous idea of allowing for the expansion of the city to cover a creek and build over the top of a creek, that idea was advanced. I suggest to you there are probably a number of citizens here in Bristol today that don't realize when they drive down Piedmont Avenue towards State Street, they're driving on top of the creek, Beaver Creek. Can you envision our city without the idea of covering the creek and building over the top? It was also during his tenure as mayor in the 1920s, and I'll ask you to think back of what the 1920s held, not only in our city but in the country. It was a great time of social upheaval. In fact, the Ku Klux Klan was extremely and not with understanding popular, not only across the country but in our area. And they chose Bristol as a place to come for one of their events. And somehow Mayor Warren got crossed with the Ku Klux Klan. And I want to read to you a very, very brief description of the incident. Mayor George Warren of Bristol, Virginia, aroused the anger of the Klan. He was summoned in for trial at Klan headquarters on State Street, West End. He refused to go. They threatened to send a hooded posse to his home on Johnson Street to bring him in with force. His reply was that he would be right there, and the first hooded SOB who stepped into his yard would be met with a full charge of buckshot. I can't find anything further about that incident, so I assume the Klan went on to their next item of business. I don't know. I also want to share with you a quote that I found, and this was given in connection with the dedication of the Great White Way. I said there were speakers, and Mayor Warren was one of the speakers. This will give you some insight as to where George Jr. got his ability to appeal to a jury, Mr. Curcio. When it came Mayor Warren's turn to speak at the ceremony, he described the city of Bristol and its growth as a little insignificant country girl whose tangled hair was meadow grass and fields of golden grain. Now, what are you going to say? The god Destiny looked kindly upon this mountain lass, gave her the beautiful name of Bristol, and touched her hair with the magic wand of progress and transformed her into a mountain queen. She sits today upon a throne of mountains and wields her kindly scepter over two of the richest, the most beautiful, and most healthful sections of the United States, East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. When I read how some of our predecessors spoke and wrote, I always come around to saying, why can't I talk like that? They had a talent that we don't seem to have. As judge, he maintained the rule of law in the city of Bristol. And of course, as judge of the police court of the city of Bristol, he was dealing with the everyday incidents of what goes on in the city and what it takes to keep order and the rule of law in place. Handling everything from certain misdemeanor offenses to alleged nuisances within the city, and you can find references to some of these matters that he had to deal with. And so he, not only as mayor, but as judge of the police court, was setting the example and making the requirements of what would be required for conduct in our fair city. As delegate and state senator, he became a member of the House of Delegates in 1927 and served until 1930. Once again returned to the House of Delegates in 1940 and served until 1947. He became a member of the Senate of Virginia in 1948 and served until his death in 1956. I couldn't find any documentation on this, but I understood that while he was in the General Assembly of Virginia, that he was largely responsible for the first local option sales tax, with the city of Bristol benefiting from it specifically in mind. As attorney, his legend certainly preceded his death, without a doubt. It is said that he handled for the defense many capital murder cases. One estimate I saw was as many as 50. Well, that blows my mind. But whatever the number was, it was large. he never had a client sentenced to death, if that tells you anything. He provided his impact on the legal profession here was far and wide. He provided the starting place for young Joe Catmull, who just graduated from the University of North Carolina Law School and came to Bristol to practice law, and he entered the law office of George Marvin Warren. Judge Catmull's picture is on the rear wall. Mr. Warren was the speaker for the dedication of the portrait of Judge Joseph L. Kelly, whose portrait is on the rear wall. Judge Kelly, many of you will know, became president of the Supreme Court of Virginia. In today's jargon, that would be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Virginia. His portrait, just as an aside, was furnished by the federal government, if you can imagine that, today, as part of a New Deal program for providing work for artists and artwork for public buildings. And Judge Kelly's portrait and Judge Ray's portrait were a part of that program. That dedication was in 1941. Probably the legal matter that put George Warren into national prominence was his representation of Judge Floyd Roberts, whose portrait is on the rear wall as well. Yes, I said representation of Judge Floyd Roberts. Judge Floyd Roberts had been named as a U.S. District Judge for the Western District of Virginia by President Roosevelt in the summer of 1938. It was a recess appointment. Congress was not in session. And he took his seat and served in that capacity until the Senate reconvened in February of 1939. The two senators from Virginia at that time were Senators Carter Glass and Harry Byrd. They vehemently opposed the appointment of Judge Roberts. And I won't get too far aside, but just fill you in just a little bit. You say, what's the problem? Roosevelt's a Democrat, Glass is a Democrat, Byrd's a Democrat, Judge Roberts was a Democrat, what's the problem? And then you remember Byrd and Glass were not Roosevelt Democrats, and they were crossed. So there was a problem. Well, who is Judge Roberts going to turn to for assistance? George Marvin Warren represented him before the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate in Washington. And of course, it was necessary for him to line up the witnesses and be prepared to present whatever evidence. Among his witnesses were the sitting governor of Virginia at that time, two former governors of Virginia, the president of the Virginia State Bar, and numerous other folks of prominence that were ready to testify. Well, he gained national prominence, and this matter was reported in national newspapers of the day. And unfortunately for Judge Roberts, he became the poster child for what it means for the president to have the advice and consent of the Senate on their judicial appointments. That may have a little familiar ring to you here today as we talk about the advice and consent of the Senate for judicial appointments. I don't know what it means if the Senate declines to advise and consent, but there was conflict between President Roosevelt and the two senators from Virginia. And Judge Roberts paid the price, but certainly had capable representation by Mr. Warren, to the point that after it was clear that Judge Roberts would not be confirmed as a United States District Judge, there were suggestions made that Mr. Warren might be acceptable in that role, which, for obvious reasons, I'm sure he declined. I want to quote to you very briefly from an editorial that appeared in the Bristol paper shortly after his death. It might be said that George Warren spent his life battling for the rights of men in the courtroom, in the halls of the General Assembly, in the City Council, wherever he was, whatever he undertook, whatever the odds. As an advocate, he had no peer. He understood human nature and loved people as few men do. He was one who wanted it written in the book of gold that he loved his fellow men. Thank you, Mr. Warren, for being a role model for all citizens, including your son and us today, on the importance of stepping up to a life of public service. Thank you, Mayor Warren, for providing forward-looking, progressive, yet sensible leadership for our young city as it struggled with growing pains and the tumultuous times of World War I and all the stresses of the social and cultural changes of those days. Thank you, Attorney Warren, for demonstrating what it means to be an ethical advocate for those in need of advocacy, in spite of personal sacrifices. Thank you, Delegate Senator Warren, for being an effective voice for our fair city in the faraway halls and chambers of the capital of the Commonwealth. And thank you, Mayor Hubbard and members of council, for recognizing that to allow the loyalty and leadership of George Marvin Warren to be lost to history would be an unpardonable omission on our part. Thank you. I'm supposed to recognize Jim Bowie, and Ed Stout, attorney here in Bristol, is looking a lot like Jim Bowie.
Indeed, my name is Ed Stout, and on your program it has J.D. Bowie, former law partner of George Warren Jr. But Jim is under the weather. He has sent a message, and Pete has asked me to read it, and I'm happy to do so. Afterwards, I might say a word or two about some of my memories with George Warren, but be very brief. Jim's message goes as follows. How appropriate that this facility to be known as the George M. Warren Justice Center. Justice is served by just laws, just prosecution of civil and criminal causes, and just defense of civil, criminal causes, and the judicial administration of trials. The two generations of George M. Warren, father and son, together contributed greatly to all those facets of justice in the community and in the Commonwealth of Virginia, spanning 100 years from the time George M. Warren Sr. started his law practice in Bristol in 1910 until the death of George M. Warren Jr. in 2010. While I never had the privilege of meeting the senior Mr. Warren in person, he nonetheless had a significant role in my most important career decision. As I approached the end of my final semester in law school, my father asked me where I would start my practice. I told him that I had narrowed this to 3 opportunities, including the practice with George M. Warren Jr. in Bristol. Without hesitation, Dad, who had served in the House of Delegates with senior Mr. Warren, said, if he's anything like his father, you definitely should go to Bristol and George Warren. I did so. After moving to Bristol, I learned more about the senior Mr. Warren, not only from his son, but also from people like the Honorable Emory Widener and Herb Hayes Sr., and many others who had known him as an extraordinary trial lawyer and the mayor of Bristol, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and Senate of Virginia. It was one of the great honors of my life when George M. Warren Jr. took me in as an associate, then as his law partner. As a diligent scholar with a wonderful talent, as an extemporaneous speaker, a quick and agile mind, a great power of persuasion, George M. Warren was the best trial lawyer I've ever personally known. Way ahead of the next best. Let me repeat that. Way ahead of the next best. George Jr., like his father, engaged in both civil and criminal trial work. While in general practice, their criminal practice was primarily defense, it was not unusual for them to be employed by victims' family to prosecute criminals. Their civil practice was a mixture of plaintiff's cases with defense practice for special clients like Southern Railway. Also, like his father before him, George Jr. was a powerful, influential member of the Senate of Virginia, representing his senatorial district and all of Virginia with distinction and to the benefit of his constituents. After several decades of private practice, George Warren Jr. was elected and re-elected to serve as Commonwealth's attorney, fairly and effectively prosecuting those charged with criminal offenses in Bristol. Early in his career, he also was on a part-time basis, served the judiciary in a position now known in federal courts as a magistrate. Then at the end of his career, he interrupted his retirement to serve as a judge in the General District Court for this district. The Justice Center could bear no more fitting name than the names of the father and son team who for an entire century served the cause of justice with such honor, dignity, and distinction. That's Jim Bowie's message. I would like to say this. 35 years ago, when I came to Bristol to practice law, one of the first lawyers I met was Larry Kirksey, and I asked him, I said, who's the best trial lawyer around? I'd sort of like to go watch and see. And without hesitation, he said, George Warren. And Lord, did I ever learn that that was true, much to the chagrin of many of my clients. And I'd like to convey to you one particular case that I can't get out of my mind. I was court appointed to represent an individual who supposedly was guilty of armed robbery of a merchant in town. And the facts were that after the robbery, he went to the Super 8 motel and spent the night. And they believed that they could find some incriminating evidence back at that hotel. And two police officers, Jerry Wright and Sam McVeigh, went up to the hotel and looked, but they'd already cleaned the room. Well, they went out to the dumpster and got down in the dumpster and dug around and found that evidence. But what's unique about it, when George did that closing argument, he was down doing this in the dumpster. He had the people in the jury in that dumpster. He had everybody in the courtroom, the judge. I was in that dumpster. My client got 57 years. A couple of sayings of George come to mind. If you surprised George about something, one of the things he would say would be, the dickens you say. Remember that one? The other, if you surprised him about something that maybe implicated his case, he would say, up jumped the devil. I want to say one more thing. This has been about 20 years ago. I had a young man who was 18 years old. He had been charged, just had turned 18, and he had 2 felonies charged with. They weren't violent crimes, they weren't drug crimes, but they were significant. I met with a young man, and he told me that if he could get in the Air Force, if these felonies were dropped, he could get in the Air Force. I took that to George Warren, and George said, well, I want to meet with the young man. And I want you to give me a certificate from the Air Force that that's true. And George sat down and met with him and talked to him and looked him in the eye and said, I can sell this to the police officer and the victim. Let's go see the judge. And we went to see Judge Brown. We dealt with it at preliminary hearing. And sure enough, those felonies were dismissed, pled guilty to a lesser charge. And here's the amazing thing. Through the miracle of social media and Facebook, I keep up with that young man. He served his 4 years in the Air Force. He's a productive citizen. He's a taxpayer living in Florida. And he's that way because of what George Warren did. George could see the good in people, and that's a great attribute for a lawyer. That's a special attribute for a human being. Thank you. I started practicing law here 35 years ago. The man who sat at that bench was Wayne Bell. He's here today to talk about his friend Georgw.
gentlemen, I think that everything good about George Warren Jr. and his father, George Warren Sr., has been said, but unfortunately for you, not quite by everybody. To that extent, I will try to be brief, but as many of you know, that probably is not within the capabilities of the average lawyer. George Warren's career and the career of his father were extraordinarily notable. And certainly fitting that both of them are honored in this ceremony today. I did not know George Warren Sr., so I can only comment on George Warren Jr. And I can only affirm, I guess, what's already been said, that George Warren Jr. was probably one of the best trial lawyers that I ever saw practice in Bristol, Virginia. He was just a natural. He was bright, he was quick, he was witty, and he was effective. Counting his time as state senator and his time as Commonwealth's attorney, and his brief time really as Judge Pro Tem in the General District Court, he served almost 40 years in Virginia constitutional offices, and that's probably some sort of record, I suppose. I first met George as a young lawyer when I first came to town, fresh out of law school. And we struck up a relationship, a friendship that lasted almost 40 years. He was one of my very favorite people. And he took me under wing pretty early in my career, as he did with really so many young lawyers in Bristol. And he shared with me his experiences, his knowledge, and his wisdom, in such a way that he made me feel more like a peer than a pupil. And I can't remember ever making a career decision, a personal career decision of mine, without first consulting with George. As was mentioned here already, he became Commonwealth's attorney in 1976, and I went on the bench in 1976. So I had a great opportunity to have George in my court on a fairly regular basis. And he was able to demonstrate that and give to the business of prosecuting trials a uniqueness that included a sense of justice and fair play and equality that really earned the respect of his peers over the years, not only his peers, but those who participated in the trial and onlookers as well. And one of the virtues that he had that I most admired was his just delightful sense of humor that all who knew him truly appreciated. And he had a knack of taking that humor and working it in a lot of times to his trial work in order to present a message. And I remember many times when George would be sitting in chambers with me and probably with the defense counsel, and we might be arguing instructions. The defendant was usually not in the meeting at the time. And George, who I often observed, would, during the course of a trial, constantly be reevaluating where he was in that trial, trying to figure out what is the right thing to do here? And often in chambers like that, he would turn to me and he would say, Your Honor, I think we better go soft on this guy. Let's go soft on this guy. And then he would say candidly, because you've probably noticed he hadn't had a thought of an idiot since he was 5. And how many times some of the older lawyers in here heard George use that expression? It's a great expression. I've used it often myself. But usually the attorney for the defendant, who often was a young guy, because as is pointed out, these young fellows would get court appointments often. And if you didn't know George, he's really taken aback, and he didn't know how to react to that. He didn't know whether to be offended on behalf of his client, or perhaps congratulate George on his tremendous insight. One thing about George, that I wanted to mention as well. Let me see where I am here. Speaking of, I wanted to tell one story that I think was particularly funny, because George didn't know quite what to do. It was one of the first times that I'd seen him sort of, kind of not speechless, but confounded. I was trying a case in Washington County, and the case involved a boundary dispute, and George was on one side and Judge Hutton was on the other. And Judge Hutton, this was the older Judge Hutton, and he had been a circuit judge in Washington County, and many of you probably remember him. Been a circuit judge for, it seemed like an inexhaustible number of years. And back then, circuit judges, when they retired, or any judge in Virginia, I guess, at that point, could resume their private practice of law after they retired. Well, Judge Hutton, who had only been retired 3 or 4 weeks, decided to do that. So this was one of his first cases as a retired judge. So he started the case, and he was representing the plaintiff, George representing the defendant. Judge Hutton put his first witness on the stand. 4 or 5 questions into the examination, George jumps up and objects to one of the questions. Well, before I could say anything or realizing what was happening, Judge Hutton stood up and said, "Overruled." Well, I was stunned. I didn't know what to do. I was and George was stunned too. But he finally got his bearings and jumped up and said, "Well, I objected that also." So finally I said, "George, I understand your concern here and how awkward this is, but I have to agree with Judge Hutton. Your objections are overruled." Well, George slid down in his chair, kind of muttering on the way down, saying, "Hellfire, now I've got to beat 2 judges." But you would be pleased to know that I did admonish Judge Hutton and asked him if he would, at least during the rest of the trial, allow me the privilege of being the only judge to comment on the evidence, and he reluctantly agreed. And I told him if he continued to do that, it would be somewhat confusing. I was only grateful that he didn't wear his robe to court. Well, Musser, Jimmy, and George, and the rest of the family, I know if George Jr. and his father were here, they would be extremely humbled by what's gone on here today, and I know you're very proud of him. George was just a gentle, kind fellow respected by his peers, a gentleman in every sense of the word, and I was very proud to be able to call him a friend. He was a great lawyer, but most of all, he was a good man.
Good afternoon. Pretty daunting to follow so many good speakers like judges and attorneys, so if you'll allow me to just pretend that they saved the best for last, boost my confidence a little bit. I'd like to thank Jimmy and the Warren family for asking me to speak. It's a great honor to be asked. I don't know how many people have been obsessed with the OJ case. 20 years ago I was obsessed with it, and the last 10 weeks I've been obsessed with the miniseries. And it ended last night, and I just kept thinking when the verdict was read, if that was George Warren prosecuting OJ, it would have been a different outcome. And then the dream team that OJ had, I thought about the fact that when I came here in 1982, we had our own dream team at that time. Edwina Mull was clerk, George Warren was part-time Commonwealth attorney, and Judge Flanagan had just come on bench. So to me, that was my version of the dream team. And when I came, Mr. Warren was in his prime. I think he'd been Commonwealth attorney for about 6 years. And he was only part-time Commonwealth attorney. He was still doing private practice, and he came in the office on a regular basis doing title work and filing lawsuits and divorces. And it's a little known secret in the clerk's office that when an attorney walks through that door, you're either excited to see them or a little cringeworthy to see them walk through the door, depending on which one it is. I'm not going to name names. But certainly Mr. Warren was one of those that when you saw him walk through the door, your face lit up. And he never demanded immediate help, but he was one of those that when he walked in the door, you dropped anything else you were doing, and you went to him, and you asked him what he needed, and you got it for him. He was a little spoiled, because we did that. We loved spoiling him, and I think he loved it too. He commanded respect without even trying, and he was very much loved in the clerk's office. I was fortunate enough that after I'd been here a couple of years, I got to start working in the courtroom. Edwina knew when she hired me that was something that I wanted to take over. And after 2 years, she felt I was ready. And Mabel got to work with him for a couple of years until I got ready. And so about 18 of his 25 years, I had the privilege of working with him in this courtroom and watching him. And he kind of took some of the things as far as his booming voice and his pounding on the table and his theatrics. He loved to be a little dramatic when it called for it. And probably, I saw him try murder trials, but the most memorable one for me was a breaking and entering in the nighttime with intent to commit rape. The victim was an 86-year-old woman. It was at knife point. He cut her finger. She was bleeding profusely. And she tried to, talk to him and be like a grandmother. She made him a sandwich. And he was apprehended and brought to trial. And I would say that trial, it lasted 3 days. And his conviction, Mr. Warren got a conviction, life plus 33 years. That may be the largest sentence I remember. But I saw him in his prime in that trial, and he was just the whole package. And one of my favorite things he would do in his closing is tell the jury, if you think he's not guilty, turn him loose. He would throw that arm, turn him loose. And it never failed that he usually got a conviction. But that time period, I wouldn't trade it for anything. It was like lightning in a bottle. It's just something that it doesn't happen all the time. And it was a privilege to work with him, and I miss him every day. Thank you.
ready to reconvene outside. Before we do so, just a couple of housekeeping things. I want to thank Ms. Warren, George, Jim, Robert for allowing me to be a part of today. This is George is like a second father to me, he wrote to me, so to be part of this today is very special. I also want to thank a couple of people before the family speech. I want to thank a few people who helped make this happen. Of course, you've heard about the city council, but I also want to thank Tabitha Crowder, her assistant, Debbie Denny. Both of them worked hard to make sure that everything was ready here, outside. Public Works has worked very hard so that we don't have to go outside a minute and stand in the mud. If you see those folks on the street, you ought to thank them. Bob Ward helped with planning, especially the reception that is to follow. Everybody, make sure you come back in after we go outside. Come back in, there's food downstairs. Jim, you want to speak on behalf of the family?
Take heart, young people, it's the mileage, not the years. Well, everything has been just wonderful. Oh, golly, I'm looking at these faces. Oh, y'all, thank you so much for coming and being a part of this and sharing with us the family. This wonderful tribute to my husband and his father. I particularly want to thank Mayor Hubbard. I understand that Mayor Hubbard said when this came about and was proposed, he said, let's get those two hackers honored appropriately. If you don't know what a hacker is, that goes back to our day. But Mayor Hubbard, thank you, and council so much. The Bar Association, you've outdone yourselves. Oh, these are my sons. I thought they were yours. And please excuse me, Judge Johnson. Judge Johnson, this is his room. This is his room. Thank you for your hospitality. And I especially want to thank the ladies downstairs who are helping with the reception. I understand that's going to be lovely, but particularly so many friends and neighbors and George's family. Addie, come over here, sweetie. Well, here, I've got 3 grandsons here. Where's the third? There you are. Come, John. Addie, come here, sweetie. Great-granddaughter. Come up here with ma'am. They call me ma'am, so they'll say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. And the Warren grandsons is Robert William and George Mason and John Warren. And this is... in about a month, 2 months, next month, the end of next month, and his daddy is a Hokie, but he's working at Clemson, and I hope they'll treat that child okay. It scares me to death. as long as it's just all ACC will be happy. But I cannot think of any greater tribute than for my husband and his father to have their name on a building that is in this city that they love so much, and a building that represents their entire life's work. I'm so proud of them and my family. I've only been here 65 years now. I haven't been here 100 years. But anyway, I've never been bored 1 single minute, as you can probably imagine from hearing these remarks by these wonderful friends. Mr. Warren Sr. Was also a musician, and he came of the period where he wrote a lot of poetry, prose, music, and one of the songs that he wrote about Bristol in the early days that he was mayor, the refrain goes, "She's a dandy little city in the heart of the mountains, the finest place I've been since I was born." Well, I want to answer Reveille. Is it Reveille? What goes on? Reveille. Reveille on Resurrection Morn. while Gabriel blows his horn. And I can say, I do too. Amen. Thank you so much, and a wonderful tribute, Mr. Mayor, and to the Bar Association for your generous contribution to all of this. Thank you.
I would love to have added that one about what you said. Well, he had that in speech at first. And they don't even have construction going on. We don't have it.
Glad to have everybody here today for this magnificent ceremony. Jimmy first brought it up to me, and I heard all these wonderful things that the Warrens had done. I knew about George Jr., I didn't know Sr. But naturally, I had to go do the research to make sure he wasn't blowing smoke. So I had a lot of fun going through all the city records, and I noticed that George Warren Sr. got the first fire truck for us, the electric type, along with the light. So that was an interesting thing. Also, he was the mayor when the city became a city manager form of government in September of 1919. So he was taking a little rest, working at the state level for a while. He came back and served as mayor on the city council about a year and a half before he passed. So that was great. George Jr., I had the privilege of living next door to him for about 8 years. We never called each other by our names. We always said, hello, neighbor. Didn't matter where we were. So that was real fun. My daughter just loved the Warren. She'd go over there all the time, play dress up, bus her and feed her, and just, it was great. She never forgot it. So everybody's already pretty much covered what I was going to say, so we got that taken care of. A little thing about the sign, we didn't save money. I got a bunch of Z's and Q's and X's. They were cheaper than the... I'm always want to save money. All right, I'm going to drop the thing here. Let's go. All right, we're ready, Art. All right, back in the way. All right, back away. Well, it looks like they spent all the money.
came out, there's food on the inside. When you go in, I forgot to thank two people that I want to thank, and that is Joe Lindberg and Pam Thomas somewhere. If it weren't for them, we wouldn't have gotten this done today, so I want to thank them as well. Everybody come back inside.
Awesome.